Welcome to another episode of Millennial Investing Explained. Here's today's question. But I want to dive into that parent aspect a little more. How can somebody overcome the biases that they might be given from their parents if they don't want to necessarily grow up the same way that their parents did? What can they do? What are some tips or tricks that they can implement that will help them break that?
Well, you could see a therapist. I would say that could definitely be an early step. Honestly, though, identifying that it's happening and identifying your triggers are really key. And I also want to point out that even if you grew up in a very copacetic household financially, there still can be weird quirks that you have as an adult. It wasn't a huge stressor in the household, but my parents are both very frugal people, and I saw that as a pattern, and they splurged in the area of travel. I do that as an adult. There are ways that I saved money as an adult that most people thought were crazy. Like I refused to get air conditioning for years. I live in New York City. My apartment would just straight up become a sauna in the summer. And I was like, I don't really care that much. I'd rather save the $150 a month. It took my senior dog passing out from the heat for me to be like, oh, I need to get an air conditioning. Very extreme example. But I just want to point out that if you had a healthy relationship, there still can be funky things that happen as an adult. Now, in terms of what you can do to stop it, again, I think you have to start reflecting on both the past and the present to start to look for connections. I have an inventory of questions that I recommend people go through in book 1, but it starts with things like, what's your first memory of money? How does it make you feel? When you were a kid growing up, how did you get money? So, did you get an allowance? Did you have to work? Were your parents just kind of buying you whatever you wanted whenever you wanted it? And thinking about those things and then trying to connect them to behaviors today can be the first step. But what then starts to happen is you've identified it. Now, how can we solve for it? So a common example I use is there are people who grew up in very financially chaotic households growing up, whether that was some months the family was flush with cash, some months they were not. It was kind of this, I've heard it identified as financial whiplash experience. Not all the time, but sometimes when you grow up that way, you can try to recreate that as an adult. Usually subconsciously, but you create financial chaos for yourself. So when you get a lot of money, you're probably going to splurge. And you're going to just constantly have that experience of not knowing how much you're going to have month to month. And the reason people will do that is because it's what feels normal and what honestly feels comfortable to them at the end of the day, because it's how they grew up. So it's time to think about, okay, what can I do to try to minimize this happening to me? For instance, having a savings account at a completely separate bank from where you do your day-to-day checking. So when you log in, you don't see a huge lump sum of cash at your disposal. It's sort of that, hate to say it with money, out of sight, out of mind mentality. So that's just an example of one of the ways you can try to solve for it.
Yeah, glad to hear some of those because I do a couple of those. And I think that my situation with money is very different than my parents. I think everything you just gave was great advice. That's all for this episode of Millennial Investing Explained. Be sure to follow me on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, or subscribe to our YouTube channel to get even more free content.